wanted to, before we get into the details of Bruckner and Fisher's Why is Death Bad, I thought that just do a little thing here, a very simple idea. Maybe, I don't know how simple it is actually, but it's an idea that's basic to their article. It's one that's been floating around. We haven't focused on it because I don't think it's the main issue of Nagel's or Epicurus's work, but it's one that was mentioned by Nagel and is closely associated with Epicurus through his follower, the great Roman poet Lucretius, and that is the so-called asymmetry problem. And really, Bruckner and Fisher's essay is meant to be a solution to that problem. So really, you can't understand what they're doing until you have a firm idea of what the asymmetry problem is, where the asymmetry is and why it's a problem. So I just wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about that. I like, when it comes to especially Bruckner and Fisher, I like to draw lines. It helps me sort things out. It helps me visualize, put together the kind of ideas they're talking about. What you have there in that dotted line is meant to represent someone's life, the time during which they are alive. And the bracket on the left is birth, and the bracket on the right is their death, and the time in between is all the time that they're alive. So all the time they're conscious, having experiences, experiencing the goods and bads of life, et cetera, like we are now. All of us are somewhere on our particular line, of course. On either side of those lifelines or those life brackets of birth and death, there is non-existence. Prenatal non-existence is, it's maybe a little bit too technical, but it's a useful term for the time before we were born when we didn't exist. That's all it means. Is all they're really saying is that before you were born, before that moment on the left side of the line, when the line begins, you didn't exist. And it was your prenatal, your pre-birth non-existence. And then if we move to the right part of the line, everything after that right bracket, death, is the time after which you were alive, during which you do not exist. So the posthumous or after death non-existence. So each of us can be thought of, whether it's helpful or accurate, I don't know, but each of us can be thought of as having our lines, and that there's, during that line is when we're alive, and on either side is the time, different times when we are not alive. The time before we were born, when we were not alive because we hadn't been born yet, and the time after death, when we are not alive because we have died. Now, okay, so if we think of it that way, posthumous non-existence, let's say from the point of view of the Lucretian or Epicurean, that is death. That is, death is just non-existence. Death is just not existing anymore. That's what death is. And human beings, being the kind of creatures they are, dread, fear, and think that death, that non-existence, is a really bad thing. It's a widespread thought that death is horrible, death is bad, death is to be feared, death is to be dreaded. Yet it is simply non-existence. However, we have another period of non-existence, or another period during which we didn't exist, and that was the period before we were born, and no one cares about that. We're indifferent to it. No one thinks, that they somehow or another, that it was a terrible thing that before they were born, they didn't exist. So we have an asymmetry, an unevenness, a disproportion in how we regard these two periods of non-existence. It's asymmetrical. That's the asymmetry of the asymmetry problem, is that we treat the two periods of non-existence asymmetrically, in the sense that we think one's a bad thing and the other we're indifferent to. We don't regard it as a bad thing that we didn't exist before we were born. We do think it's a bad thing that we won't exist after we die. So we treat them asymmetrically, and the reason that it's a problem is because, according to a Lucretian or Epicurean, we should treat them symmetrically, because after all, they are simply both periods of non-existence. So unless there's something that distinguishes them, these periods of non-existence, then however we regard them, we should regard them as being the same. That is, if we regard one as bad, we should regard the other as bad too. If we're indifferent to the one, we should be indifferent to the other as well, as long as they are essentially, in all relevant respects, the same. Since they are simply non-existences, there are periods during which we do not exist, it doesn't seem that there's anything that distinguishes them on the face of it. So the Epicurean says we should treat them symmetrically. It's a claim about rationality, really, consistency having to do with rationality. If I have in front of me 2 cups of coffee and they are exactly the same, that is, the same kind of coffee, the same amount of coffee, the same temperature in the same cup, all the things that matter to coffee drinkers. But if I were to have 2 absolutely similar cups of coffee in front of me, and I were to point to the one and say, that one's really good and that one's terrible, or I like that one and I don't like that one, that would be irrational. Because if they are indeed, if we're presuming that they're in all relevant respects similar, there's no distinction that justifies my asymmetrical treatment of them. Well, you can think of, I suppose, I don't know, these 2 periods of non-existence like those 2 cups of coffee. If they're the same and they're just non-existence, then it would be irrational to treat them differently. But yet we do. That is, if death is just posthumous non-existence, we regard death as a bad thing. We just do. If the time before we're born, we don't really care. We don't really care that we weren't born yet. We don't lament our prenatal non-existence, but we do lament some of us do, our posthumous non-existence. So that's the problem, right? That it seems on the face of it to be irrational what we do. So Epicurus would say, or Lucretius would say, it is irrational, and stop being irrational, right? At the end of the day, you should be indifferent to both of these periods of non-existence, according to Epicurus, and that would straighten things out. Bruckner and Fisher, their solution to the asymmetry problem is to justify that asymmetrical treatment, to establish that it indeed is not irrational to regard posthumous non-existence differently from prenatal non-existence. And that would be to argue, I suppose, that there is a relevant difference between them that justifies that differential treatment.